All right. How y'all doing? My name is 12 Gauge. Welcome to my channel, 12 Gauge Investigative. That sounds kind of catchy, huh? Well, tonight I have something new for you guys, as I promised a while back. I was gonna start on a new audio book reading. We did finish the Matthew Perry Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing last week. So I thought I'd get on here and I would read a little bit. This one is totally different. This is a true crime book, so I hope that y'all enjoy it. Please be kind and classy in the chat. And thank you for the mods that are here: Aquarius, Rondi, Angela Tarkinen. I know I butchered your last name. Sorry about that. Um, but thank y'all so much for being here. So let's go ahead and get started. This book is called Innocence Lost by Carlton Stowers. I always skip over these things when I'm reading um a regular book. I don't know why I do. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should go back and oh well. I'll start off right here. It said the pretty young woman dressed in the morning black and visibly weary from the stress and sleeplessness that preceded her arrival at the funeral could not get the thought out of her mind. It was there, buzzing in her brain like some silly jingle one hears on the radio and can't forget. What was she going to do with all these candied apples? That the concern could grip her as she walked toward the entrance to the church, past solemn faces and honor guards standing at rigid attention, she knew was foolish. Like so many other things that occurred in the shadowy numbness of the past few days, it made no sense. All she knew for certain in her fragile state was that her brother, half brother, actually, though she had never thought of him as such, was dead at age 21. He had been a policeman just beginning a career he had aspired to since childhood. He was someone she had loved a great deal, and he had been crazy about candied apples. The woman thought back to the days when she and her brother had dressed as goblins and visited the houses in their neighborhood, collecting Halloween cookies and candy. It was the neighbors she remembered as the tears began to moisten the corners of her eyes, who had introduced her brother to the delight of candied apples. She had been making some on the damp October evening just 4 days earlier, the 23rd, planning to take them with her on Saturday night when she and her husband were to have dinner with her brother and his fiancée. But while she was in her kitchen, dipping apples in the hot, sticky caramel mixture, a tragedy that would forever alter her life was taking ugly shape. It was not until the next day that they found him, lying face down beside his pickup in which she had so often ridden. For most of that Saturday, she had waited at home of her parents for news as law enforcement officers searched for her brother. She had been seated at the kitchen table with her mother, listening to a police scanner, when the chilling words finally came late in the afternoon. The monotone voice of a police officer confirmed the family's worst fear. Vehicle and victim located. Discontinue search. Notify family. The girl's mother began to sob as she heard the word victim, slumping forward onto the tabletop, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved in spasms as she cried uncontrollably. Her husband tried briefly to comfort her, and then walked silently into the backyard. In the living room, the young woman's 5-year-old son was lying on the floor in front of the television when the program he was watching was interrupted by a news bulletin. Jumping to his feet, he ran to the kitchen, a terrified look on his face. What he had seen was a picture of his uncle's truck, a prone body next to it. The man said he's dead, the little boy said. He burst into tears even before his mother could rush to cradle him in her arms. Now, on this bright and warm Tuesday afternoon, as she was accompanied the rest of her family and her brother's fiance to the places reserved for them in the front row of the First Baptist Church in Waxahachie, it seemed to the woman that it all happened a lifetime ago. Life seemed to pass in agonizing slow motion, fueled by a range of emotion that jumped out at her at the most unexpected times. Like others in the family, she had cried, and there were the moments when she would sit alone, oblivious to the passage of time and numb to those around her, feeling nothing, hearing nothing, a brief escape from her overwhelming grief. But the respite from her pain never lasted long. Reality would again grip her, and a sudden boiling anger would make her want to scream. And then, just as quickly, she would find herself thinking of some good time, reaching out to it as to a comforting touchstone. That, she had decided, was why she thought about the candied apples, even as she walked down the carpeted aisle toward the silver casket, her eyes fixed on the red and white carnations resting on top of it. The church had been selected for the service because Waxahachie was the largest in the triangle of the small Ellis County communities most directly affected by the tragedy. Midlothian, where the young officer had worked, was 11 miles to the west. Red Oak, where he had lived with his parents until he moved into his own apartment just 23 days before his death, was only 10 miles to the north. His mother had decided to have him buried in the Waxahachie City Cemetery next to his grandmother, who had died a year earlier. I don't want him to be alone, she had told her husband. From the elevated pulpit, the minister looked out to the largest crowd ever assembled for a funeral in Waxahachie. Every seat was filled, and many mourners stood, lining the walls of the church. The parking lot outside held several hundred more. They stood quietly, listening over a loudspeaker as the pastor spoke of the young officer's courage and dedication to the duty. The officer's grandmother, who had traveled from Georgia for the funeral, tried to count the men in uniform who had come from throughout the state of Texas to pay their respects before finally giving up. Had he been able to complete his task, he would have found there were 576, all with a ribbon of black draped across their badges. And there were the journalists, dozens of newspaper reporters and photographers and television cameramen, some far as away as New York, who had followed the tragic story since the first alert that a police officer had been slain. For most of them, it was an unpleasant assignment, one that required them once again to intrude on the private grief of people they did not know. Still, for even the most hardened reporters, it was impossible not to be moved by the service they had been dispatched to chronicle. The reports would estimate that almost 1,000 people had attended. A police chaplain delivered the eulogy, describing the officer as a young man whose mission should live on in the memory of all in attendance. He gave his life in an attempt to make a difference, to make the world a safer, better place for us all. The service ended with the playing of Amazing Grace as the honor guard silently saluted the casket. Officers standing at attention then formed a double column from the church to the hearse that would carry the fallen officer to the cemetery. Led by 20 motorcycle policemen and followed by 100 police cruisers, the funeral cortege slowly made its way downtown past the historic old Waxahachie courthouse through streets lined with people. At the corner Texaco station, a group of elderly men stood, their hats over their hearts. The flag in front of the fire station had been lowered to half-mast. Even the residential streets of the proud old gingerbread trimmed homes were crowded. Mothers stood holding the hands of small children, still too young to comprehend the magnitude of the event. Someday they would remember the day, however, and ask questions. The crowd at the cemetery was even larger than the one at the church. Grim-faced high school students from Midlothian, many experiencing for the first time the death of someone they had known, stood in small groups, some talking quietly, others standing alone, looking uncomfortable in Sunday suits and dresses. Officers from the nearby Mansfield Police Department had agreed to man the Midlothian station so all 13 of the dead man's fellow officers could attend the services, and many strangers came to pay their respects. An elderly woman stepped quietly to the side of the officer's mother, touched her hand, and said, "Your son was a hero. I just wanted to come and say thank you for what he did." Another woman, a mother from Midlothian, slipped an envelope into the grieving mother's hand. In it was a handwritten note explaining that she had children whose lives had been steered in the right direction by the impact of the tragic event. The woman's brief message meant even more to the dead officer's mother than the letter of condolence the parents would later receive from President Reagan. With a gentle breeze humming through the nearby cedar trees and flapping the green canvas canopy that had been erected over the freshly dug grave, the pastor briefly spoke again of this fallen soldier. A member of the honor guard presented folded American flag to the mother and the fiance, and from a hill behind those who had crowded near the casket to pass and pay their last respects came the clear, chilling bars of taps played by an officer from the Dallas Police Department. Then the honor guard took its orders and began firing of the traditional 21 gun salute. As the shots echoed into the blue cloudless sky, the smell of gunpowder floated over the gathering. And the young woman thought no more of the candied apples. Instead, she found herself wondering if her brother had heard the shots that were fired into the back of his head. Part 1. The undercover cop was found face down in the field. From Tweeter and the Monkey Man by the Traveling Wilburys. The phone woke Police Chief Roy Vaughn from a pleasant dream about towering pine trees and hidden lakes brimming with bass. In his half-awake state, he first thought of the ringing with the alarm clock, signaling time to get up and finish packing the van for the getaway weekend into the East Texas and Louisiana woodlands that he and his wife had been planning. But by the third ring, he had the receiver in his hand. During a lifetime of law enforcement work, first as a Dallas patrolman and now as a chief of a small force of community of Midlothian, Texas, middle of the night phone calls had become a way of life. Seldom did they bring good news. This one was to be no exception. The voice on the other end was the Lieutenant Billy Fowler. Sitting on the edge of the bed, the chief finally replied, "I'll meet you at the station in 10 minutes." Margie Vaughn sat up and turned on a bedside lamp and watched as her husband hurriedly pulled on a pair of jeans. "What's the matter?" she asked. "We got an officer missing," he said, now fully awake. "Billy and I are going to look for him." Studying the look of concern on her husband's face, she asked if he wanted her to fix him a cup of coffee. No, he said, he didn't have time. Then he urged her to go back to sleep. "Who is it?" Margie asked. "George Raffield," her husband replied, squinting into an unlit closet in search of his windbreaker. Margie enjoyed a friendly relationship with most of the men under her husband's command, but she knew very little about the missing officer. Though he had been a member of the force for 3 months and she had seen him only on a couple of times in passing. Hired to work as an undercover officer in the local high school, Raffield had not been part of any social activities involving the department. In fact, her husband had sworn him in at Lieutenant Fowler's home in secrecy rather than at the police station or city hall as was the general practice. Margie had to think for a second to connect a face to the name. Her husband had told her only that the young officer was posing as a senior to investigate drug trafficking among the high school students in the community. Aware that the operation was of the utmost secrecy, she had not pressed for details. Part of being a police officer's wife, she had learned, was not to ask too many questions. Is it serious? She said. Billy sounded worried. George hasn't reported in since around 7. His fiancee just called to say he hadn't come home. Marty glanced at the clock radio. It was a few minutes before 3 a.m. Go back to bed, Roy told his wife as he kissed her goodbye. I'll call you. Though neither mentioned it, both knew that the weekend trip was off. As Vaughn made his way through the darkened house, Sarge, the family cocker spaniel, roused from sleep, followed him to the front door, puzzled by his master's sudden departure and the fact he didn't get the customary pat on the head. Let me take a moment to say hello to everybody who's still here in the chat. Click a 1 if you're still here in the chat. I know there were 8 people. Now it looks like 5. I hope you are enjoying the beginning of this new book. The chief stepped out into the drizzle and fog of the night of October 24th, 1987, and pulled the collar of his windbreaker closer around his neck. A knot was already forming in his stomach. From Vaughn's house in a quiet residential neighborhood, it was only a 5-minute drive to the police station. Unlike the days when he had worked in Dallas, where a trip to the station could take 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the traffic, any place the chief or his men needed to be was only a few minutes away in rural Midlothian, population 7,500. The only thing that ever slowed the officer's response time was the passing of a Santa Fe freight train blocking 9th Street, the city's main thoroughfare, twice daily. That, or the red light that greeted travelers approaching the downtown area from Highway 67 and 287. His windshield wipers sweeping away the drizzle, Vaughn drove past the First National Bank and glanced at the time and temperature sign flashing from the empty parking lot. It was 61 degrees, warm for that time of year, and 5 minutes past 3. Making the turn that led to the abbreviated downtown area, he saw the lighted billboard that proclaimed the city as the cement capital of Texas. It also bore a message reminding residents of an anti-drug rally that was scheduled for the high school the following week. Vaughn and Lieutenant Fowler, would be coming from his home on the opposite side of town, should be arriving at the station at the same time. As he drove, Vaughn tried to convince himself that there was really no cause for alarm. Since Lieutenant Fowler and his wife were planning to accompany the Vaughns on their weekend trip, Raffield had been told not to work Saturday or Sunday. Fowler, who was the undercover officer's contact, had instructed him to stay out of Midlothian over the weekend and not to return until Monday morning for classes. Maybe the chief thought Raffield had already left town. But why, then, hadn't he returned to the apartment he shared with the young woman he planned to marry in April? Perhaps he had gotten involved with some of the teenagers he had become acquainted with, the dopers, as students at the school called them, and was still out protecting his cover. Or maybe he had an accident in the wet weather and was stuck in a ditch down one of the tangle of the back roads that surrounded the town. Each imagined scenario, however, was unrealistic, leaving troubling questions. One of the key elements of the Raffield's undercover training was the importance of keeping his contact, Fowler, aware of his whereabouts and activities by reporting at regular intervals. Raffield had been late with the check-in a couple of times, but only by an hour or so at most. The fact that it had been almost 8 hours since the lieutenant had heard from the officer justified Vaughn's concern. That feeling was quickly reinforced when the chief, pulling into the parking space in front of the station, saw the expression on Fowler's face. What do you think? The chief asked as the two stood there under the yellow glow of the light which burned above the station entrance. I don't know, said Fowler, drawing on a cigarette. It was the third he had smoked since being awakened by the call from George Raffield's fiancee. But I don't feel good about it. Like the man he now worked for, Fowler had spent almost 20 years with the Dallas Police Department before retiring. When they had met many years earlier, neither had suspected that one day they would be the top two men in a small town police department. Over the years, their relationship had evolved into something that went far beyond their common profession. They had become close friends. If Billy Fowler was worried, Chief Vaughn knew there was good reason for concern. Just hours earlier, the two men and their wives had sat in a seafood restaurant in nearby Waxahachie eating catfish and enthusiastically discussing the coming trip. Fowler mentioned that the undercover officer had called to check in just before and his wife left for the restaurant. Now the chief wanted to know exactly what young Raffield had said to Billy. There wasn't any kind of buy set up for tonight, Fowler said. He called just before 7. I think he was at the Pizza Inn. I asked what his plans were for the evening, and he said he was on his way to pick up Sparky Knighton and go messing around. They didn't have any specific plans. Their conversation, Fowler said, had been brief. He had reminded Raffield not to go to the football game in Red Oak where Midlothian High would be playing that evening. Raffield had come to the Midlothian Police Department from that nearby community, where he had worked as a reserve officer and civilian dispatcher. It was there that he had lived with his parents until the recent move into his own apartment. Fowler knew that Raffield had regularly worked as a security guard at Red Oak football games this season before and didn't want him to risk being recognized. Where do we start? The chief asked as the two men climbed into Vaughn's Ford. Fowler knew some of the spots that George had visited since his enrollment in school, hangouts of the kids he had become friendly with during the course of his operation. We'll try them first, the lieutenant said. After that, he shrugged. What? Vaughn asked. Fowler flipped the butt of his cigarette out the window. We start looking for a needle in a haystack. Under normal circumstances, Fowler would have liked being out at that time of night. The most enjoyable hours he had spent with the Dallas Police Department had been working deep nights, midnight until dawn. There had always been a special excitement about the facade of quiet and calm that masked the criminals' busiest hours. Violent rages, breaking and entering, drug transactions, pimps and hookers. Beneath the mirage of tranquil dark, Lieutenant Fowler well knew there was a great deal happening. And back in those days, before his wife's worry and loneliness had led him to change shifts, he had been more successful than most at finding the action that waited in the alleyways and back streets of Dallas. On this particular night, however, he felt none of the old excitement as they pulled away from the station and drove through the block-long business district of the community he now called home. DT's restaurant was dark. It would be a couple of hours before it would open for the early morning arrival of coffee drinkers gathering to discuss the previous night's game. Aside from the neon Western Auto sign shining dimly through the heavy fog and the lights of the corner washateria, the town was quietly sleeping. There was not a single car or pickup in any of the downtown parking spaces. The two said little as they made their rounds. Not ready to discuss the possibility of foul play, they were searching only for George Raffield's red GM pickup. Once they located it, they felt sure their questions would be answered. Out farm to Market Road 663, they drove past the deserted parking lot of the high school and down a nearby road that led to City Lake, which had once served as the community's water supply. Now abandoned, the small lake was frequented only by occasional fishermen and teenagers who favored its isolation to smoke pot or to find the privacy young love demanded. Vaughn navigated the maze of rutted road that circled the lake, constantly fearing that he would get stuck. While there was evident that a few other drivers had come before them, they did not encounter a single vehicle before returning to the firm blacktop that led back to the main road. On the drive back toward the farm to market road, they passed the two old story houses where Vaughn had lived when he first moved his family out of Dallas in the summer of 1968. To him, that was a lifetime ago. He had married a woman with 4 children from a previous marriage. Later, when they had a child of their own, the search for a home large enough to accommodate their family had led them from the cramped house they owned in Dallas to the rural quiet of Midlothian. As they passed the house, Vaughn made no mention of it. Any good memories had been destroyed by a bitter divorce he had not spoken about in years. Long before he met Margie, he had given up the comfortable old place and sold the few cattle he had bought for the boys as future farmers of America projects. To escape the pain of the divorce, he had put the house up for sale and moved briefly to nearby Lancaster. Again, they drove past a new high school built on the land where Vaughn's small herd of cattle had grazed years before, and turned south. Vaughn sped up, heading in the direction of a housing development located a few miles further out of town. Sitting just off the farm to market road, barren of even the scrub cedars generally found in the area, the tidy collection of new brick homes hardly justified its name. It was known as Camelot, and among those who called it home was the family of a Dallas police officer named Tom Knighton. Vaughn and Fowler had known him when he served as an instructor at the Dallas Police Department's shooting range. A man with a trim, athletic build and a boyish face that seemed always to be smiling, Corporal Knighton had been one of the first to appear at the Midlothian station and extend his congratulations after Vaughn was named chief. Like many Dallas police officers, Knighton had opted to live somewhere other than the city where he worked. For a while, the bedroom community of Duncanville, just a few miles up Highway 67 toward Dallas, had been the Knighton's home. His wife taught in a Christian academy there where his children also attended school. It had been a quiet, safe place to live until the drug problem began to creep out of South Dallas and into the suburbs. For that reason, the Knightons had decided to move further away, to Midlothian and its Camelot. Let me take a break here for a second. How's everybody doing so far? Y'all still with me here? Let me see. PKC, Rondi, Aquarius, Angela, 21 years old, undercover. I don't know where you got that. Are you looking up the case? You being nosy? It's okay if you are. The move, however, had not provided the isolated protection the Knightons had hoped for. It was their 16-year-old son, Greg, nicknamed Sparky, whom George Raffield was en route to pick up when he had last contacted Lieutenant Fowler. Tom Knighton did not know that the undercover officer had already made several drug cases against his son, Greg Knighton. In fact, had quickly emerged as one of the most active drug dealers in Midlothian High School. Fowler and Vaughn both privately dreaded the day when Raffield would complete his undercover work and arrest the youngster. Vaughn wound through the maze of darkened houses, slowing as they approached the Knighton home. There was no sign of a red pickup. They discussed waking the family and asking the youngster if he knew where George might be, but they finally decided not to chance compromising their officer's cover. There were other places Fowler wanted to look before taking such measures. Heading back to town, Vaughn drove to the P&S Grocery, a small all-night convenience store he knew to be a popular hangout of the high school students. To his disappointment, The parking lot was empty. Through the window, he could see a large woman, her back to him, leaning forward with her elbows on the counter, watching a black and white movie on a small television near the cash register. The electronic games that lined one wall were quiet, and no one was seated in either of the small booths. Damn, Vaughn said, pounding his fist against the steering wheel. Let's check Oxford Square, Fowler suggested. Though neither mentioned it, they were getting nervous. Two middle-aged men who suddenly had to try to think like teenagers and who weren't having much success. The only idea they had were places Raffield had mentioned to Fowler in his regular check-ins. The Oxford Square apartments, located just across the highway from the P&S grocery, were a federally funded low-income housing project populated primarily by the elderly. One exception was a 23-year-old Cynthia Frederick, who lived in apartment 31. Just a few days earlier, Raffield had gone there with George Knighton. George had told Fowler that a number of kids went there frequently to smoke marijuana. He had also told the lieutenant about an expensive stereo system the woman had just received, a stereo system that had recently been reported stolen. Fowler drove to the back of the apartment where Cynthia Frederick lived. There were several pickups parked in the complexes, but George was not one of them. Let's go back to the station, get on the telephone, the chief suggested. We need to call Dallas and have them look around in the area where George was buying drugs with the other kids. Fowler had told Raffield's fiancée to stay home in case George returned or called, in which event she was to phone the police station immediately. He had been silently hoping since leaving his house that he would hear the dispatcher's voice crackling on the radio to say she had called. We're going to have to call Knighton, Fowler said, speaking more to himself than to the man sitting behind him. Before returning to the station, Fowler wanted to check one more place. He directed Vaughn to a side street not far from downtown area and told him to slow down when he approached the rutted dirt road. In the early morning darkness, it appeared to lead nowhere, but 100 yards back from the street stood an old abandoned house. Once an impressive structure surrounded by stately oak trees, the paintless, crumbling two-story house had become an eyesore that many of the community leaders had complained about for years. Most of the outside walls had been torn away, leaving only the skeletal beams to show where the rooms had once been. The roof, which had once shielded a porch running the full breadth of the house, had fallen away. Several times the police had received late-night complaints from nearby residents who told of strange noises and weird chants coming from the old house. One elderly woman who had called to complain several times was convinced the sounds were from devil worshippers. A daylight trip onto the property had convinced her she was right, and she phoned the police again. What patrolmen found upon inspecting the old house was, in fact, disturbing. Pentagrams, swastikas, and vulgarities were drawn on the walls in chalk. Near an old fireplace that had obviously been recently used with the message, "By the rights of the black mass, evil will speak in this house." On the floor upstairs, someone had drawn the outline of a prone body, much like the diagram used in murder scenes. The remnants of burned candles encircled the outline. Concerned by what his officers had found, Chief Vaughn had summoned an expert in satanic cults from Fort Worth Police Department to come to Midlothian and look at the writings and drawings. The last thing he needed was a community terrified by rumors of a satanic cult. The Fort Worth officer, after a trip out to the house, had said the messages and symbols were most likely those of juvenile pranksters with no serious involvement in devil worship. Though relieved, Vaughn had ordered that the area be patrolled more frequently. He also began an effort to find out who the property belonged to. He wanted to advise the owner that the old house presented a danger and should be torn down or at least fenced off. City records revealed that the property was owned by a corporation with the headquarters in Hong Kong. George had told Fowler that the house was a favored meeting place for some of the high school kids. On a couple of occasions, he had gone there with several students after school to listen to heavy metal music and smoke pot. There had been no satanic activity, George reported, but he did recall someone mentioning a student who bragged that he'd done some devil worshipping before moving to Midlothian. Vaughn drove down the dirt road, which was sheltered by a canopy of trees, toward the old structure. In the beam of his headlight, the house looked evil. An old yellow tomcat stood on the porch and briefly stared at the intruders before scurrying off to the protection of the darkness. George Raffield's truck wasn't there, and Vaughn began backing down the road. "We're going to get rid of this fucking place if I have to tear it down myself," he said. Back in his office at the police station, Fowler placed the call to Sergeant Eddie Silva at Dallas Southwest Substation. Silva had worked as an undercover narcotics investigator for Fowler several years earlier, posing as a student at Southern Methodist University. A dispatcher said that Sylvia had just checked out to go to the nearby restaurant for breakfast. Fowler explained that it was an emergency and asked that Sylvia be contacted by beeper and asked to call him as quickly as possible. He then dialed Tom Knighton's number. "Tom, I'm sorry to wake you," Fowler said, carefully measuring his word to disguise his concern. "We're working a missing persons report on a kid named George Moore." "Yeah, I know him." "Well, he hasn't made it home, and we're told he was with your boy last night. Has Greg come in?" Knighton said he had wakened during the night to use the bathroom and was under the impression then that his son was in his room, but would check to make sure. Only a few seconds passed before he returned to the phone. "He's in bed asleep," Knighton reported. "I hate to ask you to do this," Fowler said, "but would you mind waking him up and asking him if he knows where George might be?" Again, Tom Knighton left the phone. This time, it was several minutes before he returned. "Yeah, Billy, Greg said he saw George around 7 o'clock last night. He said George came by and gave him a ride out to his girlfriend's house. Dropped him off there and left. Greg says he was out there at the Caldenhead place until her daddy brought him home around midnight." "I appreciate it, Tom. Sorry to bother you." "No problem. I hope you find the boy." Fowler hadn't even had time to relate the conversation to Vaughn before Sergeant Sylvia called from a restaurant payphone. "You're working pretty late hours for a man your age," he joked. Fowler didn't laugh. He immediately explained the problem and asked if Silva would have some patrolmen look for the red pickup in the Dallas neighborhood where Raffield had been making his drug buys. "We'll get a detail on the way," said Silva. As one who had worked undercover, he knew full well the concern Fowler was feeling. "If he's in our neighborhood, we'll find him. I'll be in touch." The dispatcher knocked on the door of the office and entered with 2 cups of coffee. Setting them on the desk in front of the lieutenant, Fowler was already dialing the phone again. When Martha Asbury answered on the first ring, his question was answered. She had still not heard from her fiancé. When Fowler said he had no news, she burst into tears. "Martha," he said, trying to calm her, "we're out looking. We've got other people looking. We're going to find him." Between sobs, she told him things he already knew. It was unlike George not to get in touch if he was going to be out late. He was too reliable, too conscientious for that. He would have found some way to contact someone, her or Billy or somebody in the family, who would have spread the word not to worry. "I've got to ask you something," Fowler said. "Did you and George have an argument of any kind? Is there some reason he might not have come home tonight?" There was a long pause before she replied, "No, everything was fine. George? She said she was looking to having the weekend off. His sister and her husband were planning to come over for dinner on Saturday. We're just trying to think of any explanation, Fowler said apologetically. I know, Martha replied. Then, after another pause, Lieutenant Fowler, something's happened to him. I'm scared. Billy Fowler did not tell her so, but he was too. Sitting in the office, even just to make the necessary phone calls, had become an exercise in frustration. Tom Knighton's mention that George had driven Greg out to his girlfriend's house provided a new area to search, something to do besides sitting and waiting. After calling Raffield's parents in Red Oak to make sure he had not gone there, Fowler followed Vaughn to the car. The country road leading out to the Cadenhead place, they both knew could be dangerous in weather like this, and there were winding little traveled back roads that would have taken Raffield to the main highway, then to his apartment, without coming back through Midlothian. Perhaps George had, in fact, taken young Knighton to his girlfriend's house, decided to go on home for the night, and then skidded off the road. Maybe they would find him stuck in a ditch, sleeping in the cab, while awaiting help from some passerby. For the next hour, they drove along the country roads, finding nothing. Though it would not be light for another 2 hours, Roy Vaughn was already planning to organize a full-fledged search party. It was also time he decided to telephone city manager Chuck Pinto, his boss, and the man who had initially given the okay to put an undercover officer into the high school. Though neither mentioned it, both Vaughn and Fowler had given up their attempts to ignore the worst-case scenario that had been running through their minds. Their experience and their gut feeling that all good police officers seem to develop told them that something tragic had happened to George Raffield. The feeling grew when Sergeant Eddie Silva telephoned from Dallas to say that his officers had been unsuccessful in locating Raffield's truck. As he stood in the front door of the small police station, silently staring out into the damp darkness, Fowler felt a sudden cold shiver run through his body. And that's where we're going to stop tonight. What do y'all think? What do y'all think about the new book? Is there anybody here? Is this thing on? Am I clear to you? Hmm. Am I lagging any? I don't know why I put Missy Beavers up there. I guess I'm going to take that down and put George Raffield. Good deal. Let me change this. I don't know why it says Missy Beavers. What do y'all think about the case? Anything? You know, freaking StreamYard pisses me off. Do y'all have any early predictions? Because I'm not going to read anymore. I'm going to leave you on suspense. Any speculation at this point so far? He was an undercover officer in a local high school trying to find out about the drug problem and making buys and stuff like this. Then all of a sudden he went missing. So what do you think could have happened to him? Look at the kids. Okay. Look at the kids. Anybody else have any speculation? Not right this moment, but can't wait to hear more. Well, I might do another chapter tomorrow night. I don't know if you've ever read to anybody, but after a while, your mouth gets dry no matter how much water you drink. And I've been having trouble hydrating for some reason. He was undercover. He was undercover. Undercover brother. So, have y'all ever heard of undercover police officers that pose as high school students? Have y'all ever heard of that? Either past, present? Anybody? Have y'all ever heard of undercover officers posing as students? I think the only thing that I've really heard of is like on that case that we are not going to discuss. I've heard, that if they got drug charges, they would become informants or whatever, but nothing like this. I often wondered if that's what they did in the past. Is like they put undercover officers into schools to bust people that were selling drugs, or But I mean, how much drug could you really be passing through a high school? You know what I mean? Yeah, 21 Jump Street. You ever see that? Both of them were hilarious, the newest ones. I didn't ever watch the series, the TV series, but I like the two movies. Good good call, Melissa. Good call. Yeah, I didn't ever watch the TV series. So how'd your week started out, guys? I hope you guys have started with a good Monday. Tomorrow, Tuesday, and then I don't know if some of you are gonna get the Wednesday off early and get a long weekend. But if you do, I hope that y'all have a very happy Thanksgiving and you enjoy your families and you enjoy all the festivities that go along with the holiday seasons, Black Friday, all that good stuff. Um, yeah, I'm gonna speak with y'all for a minute on the changes of the channel because I put a community post up. And if you must listen to my voice about Idaho 4, there are plenty of videos in my library to keep you filled with the information of the Idaho 4. If you must have your fix, there's plenty of videos in there. Go help yourself. Go watch them uninterrupted without people interrupting you or, casting their thoughts and beliefs on certain things. It's there's plenty of stuff in there. So you guys go and help yourself out. There's a lot of educational stuff in there. And, you know, just to get you by until the trial, you know what I mean? But I hope you guys enjoyed this book. I'm gonna call it a night for the night. I just wanted to introduce you to the new book, and I hope y'all have a wonderful night. Thank you so much. See you soon.